welcome to a special summer edition of the Anti-Racist Film Club podcast, a production of The Commons, the online faith space created by the South Sound Methodist Co-op. But for the purposes of this podcast, we're a bunch of people excited to watch movies and grow together through the lens of anti-racism. I'm your host, Lauren Fontanella, and today I'm joined by Pastor Heather Sparkman from the First United Methodist Church of Olympia. How are you today, Pastor Heather?
I'm good, Lauren. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. I mean, I got to see a fun movie recently, and that's always a plus.
This is a super fun movie, the one we're going to talk about. We didn't say it yet.
No, we haven't. We are discussing Barbie, which is a brand new film. I don't think we've ever discussed a film on this podcast that was currently in theaters.
I don't think so either. So we might be talking to people who haven't seen it yet.
But you all should. It's a good movie. I highly recommend it.
I do too. It was fun.
So, Barbie is based on the very popular Mattel doll brand Barbie. I'm curious, did you have any associations with the brand before seeing the film?
I grew up playing with Barbies all the time. My friends and I were big Barbie girls. So I never got to have the Barbie dream house, but some of my friends had the Barbie dream house. I had the Barbie pool. I had Barbie's horse. I had Western Barbie. I had Malibu Barbie and Malibu Ken, who I think Malibu Ken might make an appearance in the movie.
I'm guessing yes.
I think basically the Ken in the movie is sort of based off of Malibu Ken.
Mm-hmm.
I had Barbies who were brown haired. I don't know that they were called I mean, they were the Barbie brand, but I don't know that their name was Barbie.
Mm-hmm.
I had lots of Barbie clothes and accessories. So, yep, I was a Barbie girl.
Yeah, I don't think I owned any growing up. I know my sister definitely did, and she's 6 years younger than me. So, I mean, they were definitely in the house, but I think I was not really playing with dolls when she was using them. But I do remember going over to be babysat at someone else's house, and they had a bunch of Barbie dolls, and I think the dream house. And so that's my main childhood association with Barbie, is that it wasn't my thing, but it was like I would go somewhere else and play with them.
I also, in addition to having my own Barbies, I also had some of my mom's Barbies
Mm-hmm.
and some of the clothes from my mom having Barbies, which we saved some of my favorite Barbies and my mom's to pass on to my daughter, who had no interest in Barbie.
Oh, I mean, having seen the film, that seems like it might have, there was a plot point that might relate to that then.
Yes, she was actually a baby doll. She loved playing with baby dolls and just never had any interest in Barbie. So it was kind of two generations, and I think we finally got rid of them all because they were getting old and losing parts and maybe becoming a little bit like Weird Barbie, who's a character in the movie. But yeah, I got to play with my mom's Barbies in addition to having some of my own.
So then were you excited when this film was announced, were you excited to see it?
At first, I wasn't.
Ooh.
Because I think as the movie points out, for me at least, when I was young and playing with Barbies, I just loved them. I didn't have any worry about what kind of image of women they were portraying or what it might mean to have this standard of beauty that might have been conveyed by the dolls. But as I got older, I started to question the Barbie franchise and if it was really something good for women. And so I had some feelings about whether or not this was a movie I wanted to see. Did I want to continue to engage in the Barbie franchise? And also, even though my daughter never played with Barbie, she did watch a lot of the Barbie movies that were cartoons.
Mm-hmm.
They were not always my favorite. They were there was some kid TV I really liked watching with my kids, and the Barbie movies weren't one of them. It was kind of really fluffy and bubblegummy and just a little too saccharine sweet for me. So I was worried that this movie would be like that, but I started to hear people talking about it and talking about how it really examines power dynamics and feminism and all kinds of things. And then I was excited to see it. And once I saw it, I loved it for all those reasons, the issues it takes on, but I also loved it for the nostalgia.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of brought me back to my childhood love of Barbie.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that this film isn't bubblegum and fluff, but it's more than that.
It's more than that, yeah.
It's inclusive of deeper themes as well as being very bright and colorful.
I would agree with that. It has both aspects of it, which I really love. They didn't take the fun out of Barbie in this movie, but also managed, while still having fun, to really examine some much deeper issues.
Speaking of much deeper issues, that was an excellent segue. This is the Anti-Racist Film Club podcast, and we have selected a film with two white co-leads, written and directed by a white woman. Ordinarily, the types of films that we choose to showcase come from voices of color, the stories of people of color. This one is not, but I don't think it's entirely devoid of important conversations related to topics that we often venture into on this podcast. So, could you say a little bit about why we thought this was a good choice for the club?
So we have been very intentional, like you said, about choosing films for the Anti-Racist Film Club that feature stories about people of color, are written and directed by people of color, and star people of color. But the Barbie movie and the Barbie franchise has been so dominant in our American culture. I think has so much influence over how particularly young girls and then women see themselves, that this movie, in addition to how the movie itself deals with issues of people of color and anti-racism or racism, as the case might be, I think also just looking at something that has had this much influence over our culture ends up allowing us to ask questions about anti-racism and to ask questions about our standard of beauty and to ask questions about who might be left out of these conversations or depictions and how we come to have cultural standards of beauty. So I think there's actually a lot in this film that lends itself well to a conversation for the Anti-Racist Film Club.
On that note, I think we should read a description of the film so that we can actually dig into some of this.
Sounds good.
Barbie is a brand new comedy from writer, director, and decidedly feminist auteur Greta Gerwig of Lady Bird and Little Women fame. It was also co-written by Gerwig's partner Noah Baumbach. Baumbach? Baumbach. I don't know.
I bet it's Baumbach,
Baumbach.
but I don't know for sure either.
I'm not going to do that again. We're just going to go with it.
Okay.
The film stars Margot Robbie, Ryan Gosling, America Ferrera, Issa Rae, Simu Liu, Kingsley Benadir, Will Ferrell, and many other actors that you should probably just look up in IMDb. Based on the iconic and billion-dollar fashion doll brand, Barbie is the story of a Barbie girl in a Barbie world who begins to inexplicably dwell on the concept of death. In order to return to a life of bliss and avoid cellulite, Barbie travels to the real world and discovers that her feminist utopia isn't quite a reality outside of Barbie land. Meanwhile, her boyfriend Ken discovers the patriarchy and begins to believe that maybe, just maybe, he and the other Kens would benefit from systemic misogyny. Can Barbie survive the real world without spiraling into depression? Will she succeed in wresting the status quo back from the wayward Kens? Will the ghost of Ruth Handler ever be explained, or does the real Mattel Corporation have a haunted 17th floor? The 2023 Barbie film asks not just what it means to be the stereotypically perfect woman, but what it means to be human in the first place.
That sums it up. I don't even know if I need to see the movie now. No, of course, I've already seen it. But that's a great description of what happens in this movie.
Thank you. So, where do we want to begin?
I would love to start by talking a little bit about intersectionality. You asked why we would choose this movie for Anti-Racist Film Club, and I gave at least part of our thinking behind it. And I have more reflections that I'll share as we go along. But I also want to talk about the idea of intersectionality and why we might look at this movie that really deals with feminism and women's issues more than it deals with anti-racism or issues that people of color might face. And the idea behind intersectionality is that we can't ever look at anything siloed. So we can't talk about feminism without talking about anti-racism or anti-classism or all the ways that we try to diminish people's stories and view them as less than human. And so even though this movie isn't specifically looking at anti-racist issues, we recognize that people who are dealing with racism are often women or identify as women. And so when you're facing things like sexism or racism or homophobia or things like that, you're often not just dealing with one way of just being discriminated against, but multiple ways. And when we examine these various means of discrimination, we begin to find overlaps. And in dealing with one, we can also make progress on another one. And so I think that even if we didn't talk specifically about anti racism, which we will, even just looking at this from an intersectional lens will give us some interesting conversation.
Yes. I'm very curious what points of the plot you found representation of intersectionality, because I have very mixed views on this film, on this topic, which I'll let you go first, but I have thoughts as well.
So the film intentionally, I think, puts people of color in various roles within the movie. One that stands out the most to me was the president of Barbie Land is a person of color. She's a Black Barbie.
This is the character played by Issa Rae.
Yes. And so I think one of the questions that when we're looking at a movie that is written and directed by someone who's white, who mostly stars white characters and actors, we have to ask about the placement of people of color in the movie. And is it tokenism? Is it really showing the fullness of their humanity? Are people cast in those roles simply to be able to say it wasn't an all white movie? Is it really diverse casting that gives us a depiction of the real world? So I think I had some questions about the placement of some of the characters of color in this movie and whether they were really done to show a fullness of humanity and tell stories of people of color, or if they were done just to make sure this movie wasn't all white.
Margot Robbie has said in interviews that, because she was part of the creative team, I believe she was one of the producers who was putting this film together before it had a director, before it was written. And she didn't initially plan on starring as the main Barbie and only ended up agreeing to do it after the real Mattel company had made some changes with diversity and representation in the actual doll brand itself. But I can't cite that interview at the moment, so you'll have to fact check me on that, listeners.
Well, and I think that brings up one of the issues as well. So, a big criticism of the Barbie franchise has been how it affects women's image of themselves, particularly probably around standards of beauty and body image. But we often have this conversation as if the only problem would be Barbie's body shape at being unrealistic, or her beauty as unrealistic for women to aspire to. But what we don't often talk about is how for so many years, the Barbie franchise was largely white. And so it was not only promoting a standard of beauty around a certain body type, it was also promoting a standard of beauty that was based on blonde hair, blue eyes, and pale skin. Around the release of this movie, like you alluded to, Mattel has done some diversifying of the dolls that are available with, I cannot remember, Lauren, you'll have to tell me the name of their new line of dolls.
Oh, it was the Fashionista line. Yeah, like 2015, 16, around there.
Yeah, so that there are some more diverse dolls, but I'll actually tell you, you ask about my experience with Barbies, and my daughter is Black. She's not white. She's adopted from a country in Africa, which I'll just put in a little plug that Africa is a continent, not a country. And so she comes from a specific place in Africa. And when we were adopting her, we had the chance before she was able to come home to send some toys to her with a family who was traveling to pick up their own adopted child. And we were on a tight time frame. I had to like go to the store, get the things I was going to send her and get them in the mail to be able to get them to the family before they left to go pick up their child. And I went to Target and I tried to buy a doll of color, and there was none. And I was specifically actually looking at Barbies or dolls like Barbie because they're small and so they would travel well versus like a bigger baby doll. There was only white dolls to buy. I actually called a friend of mine who also adopted from a country in Africa and said, could I send a white doll? And she said, no, you absolutely cannot do this. It would be so culturally inappropriate to send this to this country, that doesn't really have white people in it. And so I immediately, before my daughter was even home, ran into the racism around toys in America and specifically around the Barbie franchise.
Mhm.
We also have experienced this over the years in trying to buy my daughter baby dolls that look like her and other dolls. And so, when we talk about how Barbie promotes a certain image of women, we often ignore that it's also promoting a very white image of women. And so that's another way that I think intersectionality is a part of this conversation.
Yes, I was doing some research into the history of the Mattel's company, specifically the Barbie brand's history with depicting different races. It looked like they had a black doll as early as 1967. So, I don't know, like 12 years into the company forming. But it was called, let me actually pull it up. It was a variation of a white doll. So, it wasn't created explicitly as a new character, and the name of the doll as it was marketed was called Colored Francie.
Oh my goodness.
And it was just a Francie doll with a darker skin pigment. They didn't remold it or remodel it in any way. It was just a white doll with darker skin, which is not really representation at all. And it wouldn't be for a couple more years until they had Christine, or either Christina, one of those two names, which was the actual first Black Barbie doll.
And one of the things that we have noticed in trying to buy dolls of color for my daughter is that sometimes a company like Mattel will make dolls, like maybe Christy or Christina, but they're very hard to find in the stores.
Mm,
And I think this is one of the ways where we can really examine how dominant culture and capitalism really intersect. So I understand we live in a very, not as much now, but 10, 15 years ago when I was trying to buy these dolls, a very white community. And so my guess is that dolls of color didn't sell very well. So the stores didn't stock them on their shelves. But that also means that any child or parent going to the store to try to buy a doll, whether you are a white parent buying for a white child or parents of color buying for a child of color, all you were going to see was these white representations.
mhm.
Even when companies put out one or two dolls that have more representation, are they really available and are they marketed in the same way? In the movie, the blonde blue hair blue haired the blonde blue-eyed Barbie played by Robbie is eventually referred to as stereotypical Barbie.
Mhm.
One of the questions I have is that image of Barbie, stereotypical Barbie, marketed different than the Barbies of color? And I think the answer would be yes.
Yeah, I mean, she's marketed as the default, and everything else is sort of an abstraction away from the presumed status quo, which is white.
Which I think in this movie, you can see that probably in the writing of it, Greta Gerwig was really wrestling with how do we name this dynamic that this representation that Margot Robbie gives us of who Barbie is what we think of when we say the word Barbie.
Mhm.
So she calls her stereotypical Barbie, but in the fact that she's stereotypical Barbie, it means that everything else would be compared to her and she would still be the standard. And I don't know that the movie really deconstructs that, even by having characters of color in Barbie land. Stereotypical Barbie is so dominant in this movie that she still ends up being the standard that everything else is kind of compared to.
We're sort of hovering around my main issue with conversations about representation in this film, because there are Barbies with different races, different heights, different body types, their ability and disability. There are a lot of different types of people represented in Barbie Land and in the real world, but we're focusing on Barbie Land here. And it all seems to boil down to the idea of there's one thing about them that makes them not stereotypical. And that's part of the plot. Like, there's an astronaut Barbie and all she does is astronaut. There's a president Barbie and that's her entire role. And stereotypical Barbie is just kind of nothing. And that's Margot Robbie's character's personal journey, is to figuring out what she has a purpose, or is she an object or whatever. But in the casting of the film, the way that they kind of chose to depict diversity was in a very unintersectional way.
Mhm.
There is a Barbie in a wheelchair, but she's also white. Or there is a black Barbie, but she's also beautiful. And there is a Barbie played by a trans actress, Hari Neff, but I don't know if the character is supposed to be trans. But either way, still very like fair skinned and able bodied. There are things that make the Barbies different from each other, but there's not multiple things. They don't stand too far away from the stereotype.
I would agree. And part of the premise of Barbie Land is that really all the Barbies, like you said, are very, they're all Barbie, even if they look a little bit different or have a different profession. But there's really no nuancing either of the way they look. Like you said, there might be one thing that separates them physically from standard Barbie or stereotypical Barbie, but there's not a range of diversity. But also their stories are really flat.
Mm-hmm.
Their personalities are very similar. You know, you don't see, for example, in President Barbie, something that sets her apart from any of the other Barbies where you would say she had the talent or she had the skills to be President Barbie. And I think some of that's intentional to try to represent Barbie Land as everyone's very similar. But I think it also undermines some of the diversity that the movie is trying to portray.
Yeah, I don't know how much of this was like, I don't know how much I can critique this because if it's purposeful, if they're trying to make a point that each of the people cast in this film is one abstraction away from Margot Robbie's in some variety, then that's satire and it's helping back up the narrative of the film. But on the other hand, it's also bad representation, and if you're not analyzing and looking deeper into the choices, then it's just reinforcing the ideas that it's like cleverly winking at. But I also don't know how much of it is intentional in the first place.
I had that same tension. I found that about so many aspects of this movie. Sometimes I don't know if I'm in dialogue with the movie or if I'm in dialogue with the larger Barbie franchise that's depicted by the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is maybe some satire in keeping everybody only one step away from the stereotypical Barbie of pointing out that this franchise really it's kind of cookie cutter for however much Mattel has tried to have a nod towards diversity. It's still a very cookie cutter franchise. And I think the movie is poking some fun at that, or at least playing with that idea. But again, I agree. If it's unexamined, then it starts to become the norm. And so we look at this and say, this is what representation looks like when that's not really true. But I also think that this movie has opened for me at least a larger dialogue about the role that Barbie has played in our culture and that's part of what the conversation's about too.
Mm-hmm. I think Barbie Land doesn't necessarily get deconstructed along these lines, but when they go to the real world, the main human family that is interacted with does kind of address more of these things. It's a family that has more than one thing going on, and that's part of what makes them human. And that's America Ferrera's character, her daughter, and then the husband who only comes in a couple scenes.
Yeah, I thought when the movie moves into real world that the representation was better. You have this family that's diverse, obviously, actors of color playing the mom and the daughter, and then the dad's white. But again, I think that shows us something outside of a cookie cutter family. One of the things I noticed, and I think I have an eye to this because of the struggles we've had finding dolls for our daughter, is that America Ferrera's character plays with white Barbies.
Mm-hmm.
She plays Gloria, who is obviously a person of color, but her childhood Barbies were white. And so, even in the real world, there's still this idea that stereotypical Barbie maybe plays a larger role in the lives of girls than we might hope when we're looking at this from an anti-racist lens.
And I wonder how much of this is packed into Gloria's daughter. I'm forgetting Sasha.
Sasha. Hmm.
Sasha's rejection of the entire Barbie brand, because she very much plays into the Barbie is overrated. She's a fascist. She's a symbol of oppression, and completely rejects it. And I wonder, it's not stated out loud, but I wonder how much of that is tied into this discussion.
So I read an interview with Greta Gerwig where she talks about how she got Mattel to let her leave that line in the movie. So obviously, this movie couldn't be made without the endorsement of Mattel, since it's, using Barbie. She intentionally put that line in there to address so many of the concerns about Barbie. She didn't talk about this in terms of representation or from an anti-racist lens, but she did talk about having Sasha voice that line because Barbie has been so controversial, and because I think women are wrestling in a different way with these standards that we see in Barbie, and whether or not we want to embrace or reject them, or how we can both love Barbie and also reject some of the messaging around it. And so Greta Gerwig wrote that line really as an examination, I think. And I think what it did is, for the viewer of the movie, is to prompt us to continue asking questions about this, certainly have fun and watch the movie, but also to recognize that there's still things to talk about and debate around Barbie and how she represents women and, people in general.
And I think that the idea of one symbol representing not just women, but like the people in general, really gets broken apart during Gloria's speech when she's in Barbie Land, and kind of going off about all the ways in which there's an impossibility to meet the expectations of women in the real world, kind of in Barbie Land, because it's going through some political turmoil at the moment, but mostly breaking apart the ways that there's contradictory messaging and requirements in order to be the stereotypically perfect woman.
Yes, I don't have the quote in front of me, but she does such a good job. Gloria's character does such a good job of talking about things like, as women, we're expected to want to be skinny, but not too skinny. And we can't call it wanting to be skinny or thin. We have to say we want to be healthy. And she goes on to nuance multiple ways in which women are really caught in this trap of both, we need to be everything, but not too much of everything, all at the same time. Here's part of it. I found part of the quote. We have to be thin, but not too thin. And we can never say we want to be thin. You have to say you want to be healthy, but you also have to be thin. You have to have money, but you can't ask for money because that's crass.
Hmm.
She goes on to name a number of different ways in which women are often caught in these contradictions.
Yeah, there's bits about ambition too that I found interesting.
Yeah, you have to have ambition, but you can't really be seen to have it, to want success. Like, you have to both want it and not appear to want it at the same time. You
Mhm.
have to love being a mother but not talk too much about your kids. And I mean, even in that, you have to be ambitious and want to be a mother at the same, like all of these contradictions and tensions that women hold. So there's a line that comes really early in the movie where, in Barbie Land, Margot Robbie's character, stereotypical Barbie, assumes that because Barbie has offered depictions of women being astronauts and president and vets and doctors and all the things, that feminism has been solved. Barbie has fixed feminism, has fixed all the problems that women have faced. And now everything's great for women because we can have it all and do it all, which I would say is part of the contradiction that women inherit, is that we should be able to somehow do it all.
Mhm.
And that the movie really is deconstructing that idea, which kind of culminates in that speech by Gloria. And I think that the movie is intentionally doing some deconstructing of how Barbie has participated in these unrealistic expectations.
Yes. One of the articles I was reading less about the movie and more about the Mattel company, I came across this quote from Dr. Rodney Collins, who is head of human sciences at Macon World Group. He was quoted in this article. So much has gone well for Barbie throughout her history that the brand has failed to register what has always been an ugly, uncomfortable truth about the doll and her ambition for female empowerment. She has simultaneously perpetuated standards of beauty and success that are not only exclusionary, but also impossible to achieve.
Mm, yes. Exclusionary and impossible to achieve. That pretty much sums it up.
I mean, even having the black Barbie, I mean, I don't know if there's multiple black Barbies in the film. I didn't notice, but they make a big deal kind of about the one being president, and she didn't really have the same obstacles in her way that anyone would have had in order to become president. I don't know if there's elections held in the Barbie world or if you pop into being as you're created and then you just have the responsibilities of that job, whatever they may be. But it almost felt like it was like a black actress not playing a black character.
Yes, I would agree with that. I think it's interesting that you say that, did she just pop into being and be president without facing any of the obstacles? There's a scene in the film where Ken is in the real world and has discovered patriarchy. And so he assumes that he can just go be anything he wants to be. And so he walks into a hospital and tells a female doctor, actually, that he's ready to go do a surgery. And she says
An
to him,
appendectomy.
yeah, an appendectomy. Have you gone to medical school? No. Well, you can't do that. And he has this assumption, which perhaps comes from Barbie Land, where there are no obstacles and you just come into being as a president or a lawyer or a doctor. He just has this assumption that he can assume a role without doing any of the work or facing any of the obstacles. And it does really feel like that with the characters, all of the characters in Barbie Land, I think, except stereotypical Barbie, who is facing some challenges and trying to overcome them, but that, they are kind of flat representations rather than being nuanced or having growth or having obstacles to overcome.
Yeah.
Well, Lauren, on Anti-Racist Film Club, we don't often talk about church or the Bible, even though we are a church that produces this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
I found it interesting. So I'm a female pastor. You introduced me as Pastor Heather, and we're a part of a denomination that ordains women, but not all denominations believe that women should inhabit this role. I noticed there were no Pastor Barbies in the movie. I'm not surprised. I don't know that Mattel has ever made a Pastor Barbie. I do have friends on Facebook who are pastors and women who have made their own Pastor Barbie, but I was thinking about the depiction of women in the Barbie movie and how women are depicted in the Bible, and actually how the church historically has flattened the depiction of women. So if one of the things we noticed about this movie was that characters of color, besides Gloria and Sasha, are often very flat and don't have a lot of nuance. That has been one of the things that the church has often done to women characters in the Bible, taken these nuanced women and turning them into really kind of flat cardboard cutouts. And I was just thinking about the interesting narrative that women have faced in so many different aspects. So we see it in the Barbie franchise. We certainly can see it often in depictions of women throughout history and depictions of women in the church, where our stories are flattened. A lot of our individuality is taken away to portray this iconic or stereotypical view of who women are. And so I was thinking about some of the great women characters in the Bible who are really diverse. We have like Ruth and Naomi, who end up going on a long journey together and out of nothing kind of building a life after their husbands have died, and they find a new way in the world, really self-actualizing and self-determined. You have Mary, the mother of Jesus, who has this amazing prophetic voice. She speaks more eloquently than many of the male characters in the Bible. But usually what we talk about her is, she's the mother of Jesus. She was meek, she was mild. when actually she wasn't. She had this great voice that just calls out the injustice of the world and really has hope for a new world. I think that so often that same kind of thing happens to women where their contributions to history, where their accomplishments are ignored in our larger narrative.
Mhm.
So I was thinking about Mary, the mother of Jesus, with this great prophetic voice who calls out injustice and dreams of a better world. And it's been in the news lately that there's going to be a memorial to Emmett Till, and actually that his mother is going to be memorialized as well. And now I've forgotten her name, which
Mamie Till Mobley.
Mamie Till. Yes, thank you. We can't not say her name. But Mamie Till actually, she advocated for Emmett Till to have an open casket at his funeral so that people could see the horrors that had happened to him. And it ended up being a turning point in the civil rights movement. And so often we ignore this woman who knew things could be different and was willing to stand up to convention and to advocate for her son's story being told in a way that would influence people to begin to see the horrors of what was happening to people of color. And I think by the end, there's places where the Barbie movie gives amazing voice to women, particularly, I think, through Gloria's character.
Mhm.
And I really appreciated how out of this franchise where you get stereotypical Barbie and these Barbies that maybe don't have nuanced stories, how the movie does give voice to women, at least through Gloria's character, and invites us to maybe think about individual stories rather than just looking at stereotypes.
The idea of giving voices to characters who have been silenced or reduced to one thing, specifically female characters, reminds me also of the Margot Robbie Barbie's sort of realization and catharsis at the end of the film, where she has her own speech about not wanting to be the object, but part of the creation,
Mhm.
the ability to actually tell stories. And part of what I think this film is angling at is that there needs to be more diversity behind the scenes in order to tell a more inclusive narrative in any variety of storytelling. It doesn't have to be film, it doesn't have to be playing with dolls or anything. It's just that for so long, the reason female characters and real life figures have been reduced to one thing is that they had no agency in the narratives that were told about them.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. You know, I talked about the depiction of women in the Bible. And what's so interesting to me always is the difference between like the stories of women in the Bible and the way the church tells those stories.
Mhm.
And historically, of course, the church has been dominated by men in power. And so men have been taking these stories of women from the Bible, reinterpreting them and retelling them and taking away women's agency. And I really think this is one of the values of having women preachers, having preachers of color, kind of deconstructing power structures that only represent the dominant culture, because this is how stories get diminished and how they become like cardboard cutouts. And when we can have diverse people in the creative process, in the storytelling, our narratives are less likely to get collapsed. And I think you're right that this movie is really nudging that. We could talk about the board of Mattel as it's depicted in the movie. You had a great take on how they do that. I'd love to hear what you thought about the chairman of the board or the chairperson, although it is a man, the chairperson
Mhm.
of the board and the board of Mattel as it's depicted in the movie.
Oh gosh, I'll have to try to remember what I said the other day. The idea is it's Will Ferrell's character, and I think they call them the suits is the Mattel board, and everyone wears a dark suit and a dark tie, but he's the CEO and he wears a pink tie. And he's all about putting some amount of voice to women empowerment, but then also extremely defensive of the history of Mattel and saying like, "Oh no, we had a women CEO twice, once in 1990 something, and then I don't remember when the other one was, but she was important." Not that either of those real life figures were ever named. Although if I flip back through my notes, I could find at least one of them. But I won't do that now. Uh, but I think the pink tie and the costuming was really emblematic of Mattel's role in the movie, where yes, he's this man in a suit, but it's a very performative act of wearing a pink tie and having some femininity. But in reality, it's still a tie, which has historically been a symbol of masculinity. And just because it's pink doesn't actually reclaim any feminist power. It's very surface level and easy to do, and more about corporate branding than actually saying anything. Which I think was my other main problem with this film, is that it has a weird relationship with its parent company. And I wonder how much of it is studio notes or like an inability to make Mattel the real villains. But they are antagonists for most of the runtime. And then in the end, their antics are sort of played off as like harmless bureaucracy. Like, it's not so bad, everything that they do and the oppressive stereotypes that they perpetrate. It's just business. It's just what they have to do. And that doesn't quite sit well with me.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's one of the unresolved threads in this movie is that there's no change in the power structure of Mattel. So this movie is making this argument about women and women's stories and moving beyond things like stereotypical Barbie. And, Barbie finds her voice and finds her own hopes and dreams. And yet the movie ends and the suits are still all male. And I found that really actually kind of disturbing. While I realize that this movie can't change the actual corporate makeup of Mattel,
Which does include women. Like, I highly doubt that there are no women who work in high ranking positions at Mattel at the moment. There's no way.
I would hope that that's true. And yeah, and so then I just thought that was such an interesting choice. So if you're a young person watching this movie, I think if I'd watched this when I was a little girl, and at the end of it, part of what I would have taken away is that there is no place around the table at some place like Mattel for me. And I think that this can end up being such a dangerous narrative because when we don't get to tell our own stories, whether that's as women or people of color, and stories are told for us, they're often told in favor of the dominant culture. And that can silence and I think actually open the door for harm. This is one of the points that's actually being made by dissenters in the Southern Baptist Convention, who doubled down on their conviction that women cannot be ordained. And so they won't have women pastors. And there's a number of women in the Southern Baptist Convention who talk about how this allows abuse to happen and women are not allowed then to have voice. So they don't get to talk about the harm that's done to them. And so it becomes this self perpetuating power structure where people who are in power hold on to power by telling the stories of others
Hmm.
and making sure that those are diminished stories. And so I actually wish that the movie had done something different with the suits around the corporate structure, the corporate table of Mattel, even in just a nod to women should be a part of telling women's stories. If we have a doll that's supposed to represent women, women should be a part of that.
Yeah, it even feels like they were kind of setting that up as a resolution for Gloria's character,
Yeah.
who gets no resolution at all at the end of the
Yes.
film. But her arc is that she works downstairs at Mattel, the way that like movies use skyscraper imagery in order to show power structure and stuff. She works at like the ground level. She has a desk job, but what she does is spend her time sketching out designs for Barbies or Barbie clothing. And it seems like maybe where that's going is having creative fulfillment of her life, because I mean the things that she's sketching are like depressed Barbie and like she's not happy, and that's part of the entire crux of the conflict in the film, is that Gloria is not happy and is not fulfilled. And then by the end of the film, you'd think that she would move upstairs or have some outlet for her voice and her designs, but she doesn't. She's just supporting Margot Robbie's character in the last scene, which, like, they kind of lampshade. They have a line about, like, oh, white savior Barbie, and they're like, oh, that's funny because, you know, we can't, like, support the idea of having a white savior character be our main protagonist, but they don't actually disprove that narrative, and Gloria taking a literal backseat to Margot Robbie's Barbie character in the resolution of the film is very strange to me.
I thought so too. I think this is another place where the film falls short of being truly representational or anti-racist.
Mhm.
Again, like we talked about these nods to, having like the president of Barbie Land be a black Barbie. But here you have Gloria, who is a character of color. And while she has arguably the best lines in the movie, because she gets to deliver the monologue that really, I think, is the theme of the movie, the tension around what it means to be a woman, her story isn't resolved. And she does become like a supporting actor to stereotypical Barbie's story.
Mhm.
And it's interesting because she actually comes up with the idea for ordinary Barbie, which the suits are in favor of because they think that it will make them money.
I mean, they shoot it down first. They're just like, "No, that we're not doing that." And then someone runs the numbers and they're like, "That would sell." And they're like, "Oh, we're totally doing that."
Right, like, yeah, let's do it because 'cause it'll make us money, but you never get to see, like, her actually taking any kind of, leadership in that. It's not like they promote her at Mattel or give her a seat around the corporate table or, she gets to be the creative force behind ordinary Barbie. The best she gets to do at the end of the story is drive stereotypical Barbie.
To a gynecologist appointment.
Yeah, I was gonna say, do we wanna do the final like, spoiler? She goes in back to this, uh, like, really, again, a supporting character to stereotypical Barbie's journey, and I was left a little troubled by that. I wanted I wanted Gloria's story to be as important as stereotypical Barbies, and I don't think the movie did that.
The very last line, which is the gynecologist joke, also I it's funny. I think everyone in my theater laughed when they said it. That's, like, the very last thing you hear before the credits roll is that, "Oh, it's hilarious that Barbie's going to a gynecologist." But the last 10 minutes of the movie take a very hard turn into what it means to be human, and specifically for Barbie's character, like, what does it mean to be a woman? And with that line, it feels a little transphobic to say that, like, what it means to be a woman is to have to go to a gynecologist. And, like, that's a universal experience that every woman in the world has. And that's not true. And that's the last thing we hear.
That's so interesting. I had not thought of it through that lens, and I really appreciate that, which I think is part of why we talk about intersectionality, right? Not just looking at it through the lens specifically of feminism, or as I heard somebody say about this, it's a really white narrative about feminism, right?
Mhm.
Or
Mhm.
not looking at it just from anti-racism, but to take really a full look at how this movie deals with different kinds of narratives. And I hadn't even thought about that. And I really appreciate you pointing that out. It depicts one version of what it means to be a woman. And not all people who identify as women need to go to a gynecologist.
It it just feels like they were building up to sort of a big realization or resolution, and then, like, the last 7 minutes, I think, fumble it for me. Both in terms of Gloria's character.
And Barbies.
Yeah, yeah, and Barbie's character. Like, both of them, I think, they don't quite land anywhere.
Well, and that after this big revelation that stereotypical Barbie has about what it means to be human, and I think, like you said, specifically a human woman. I mean, a lot of what Ruth Handler, who's kind of her mentor, not just because she is attributed as being the creator of the Barbie doll, but in this movie kind of helps stereotypical Barbie maybe to realize what it means to be human. And a lot of it's around motherhood.
Mhm.
So it's very emotional and poignant, and then what we get is it's almost like a trivialization. what she's doing is going to the gynecologist, right? Like,
Mhm.
I mean, I guess I had hopes that she might end up around the corporate table in Mattel. I had hopes that Gloria might end up in a creative position at Mattel, or at least either one of them in a place with more voice and agency than Gloria driving Barbie to the gynecologist.
Yeah, we seem to be on the same page here.
Yes. And I mean, again, I think that this sometimes has to do with really dominant culture falling short of giving us really nuanced and empowering stories that take the fullness of who we are. So you have the speech by Gloria, the monologue by Gloria about all of the nuances and tensions around what it is to be a woman. And then, sort of this really kind of collapsing of that at the end into something kind of trivial.
Mhm. I don't wanna we're running out of time here, and I don't necessarily wanna end the podcast on such a disappointing note,
I
so,
agree.
if you could think of one summary from the film, because overall, I enjoyed the movie, and I think it has a positive message. What would you want someone going to the theaters to take from it in terms of what this club is interested in discussing?
I think that part of what I would want someone to take from this movie is that there are so many different ways to be a woman. And even though we talked about how maybe the movie sometimes falls short of depicting that, I think that in her own way, stereotypical Barbie has been pigeonholed where she's supposed to just be about being happy and beautiful and loving fashion
And Beach.
and beach, right? And that this narrative turns that on its head and really maybe lands in the place that a life filled with tension and ups and downs and struggles and humanness is a better life than living in a plastic perfect world. And I think Ken's arc, which we didn't talk about, but I think Ken's character arc in its own way reinforces that as well. The value of self determination and self actualization, and to come out of the Barbie franchise, which in our culture, in so many ways, has dictated for women what we should look like, or what we think we should look like, and what we think we should wear, and what it means to be attractive. This movie, I think, really turns that on its head and says that maybe the best thing is to be real and to be human and to have self determination. And I appreciated that so much. It helped me love Barbie again, which is a little girl who played with her Barbies so much and loved them, and then went through a time of probably feeling like Sasha's character, who called them, besides fascist, I can't remember what else she said, but it was not positive. It helped me fall in love with Barbie again and recognize how Barbie helped me learn how to be a woman. Sometimes in arguing against what she represented, but also embracing the idea I could do things in the world. I could be a vet or a doctor, an astronaut. I didn't want to be all those things. I had to wrestle with that too. But I appreciate that the movie allows Barbie to discover herself. And in that, allowed me to fall in love with Barbie again. How about you, Lauren? What's the thing you want people to take away from this movie?
Oh, man, I'm never on the other side of this question. Oh gosh, the tables have turned. I would agree with what you have said about the self-actualizing. I really feel like I resonated with Barbie's thoughts on not being the object.
Mhm.
It's not necessarily about having a plan or like having a dream. She doesn't end the movie with a dream or an idea of what she wants, but that it is okay to want to discover that. And you don't need to have it figured out, and that if you do pop into existence with a purpose, that's not realistic,
Yeah.
and you are absolutely allowed to question or your reality and decide if it actually makes you happy. And that I think is the message from the film that will stick with me the longest.
Yeah, and I think in both of us, as we concluded with what we loved about the movie or what we want people to take away from it, neither one of us mentioned specifically anti racist ideas, but I think that they really are, valuing people being able to not be objects, to see themselves as being able to have self determination, to be able to have more than one option for your future, right? Not just to think this is what I have to do or who I have to be. I think that that's at its heart embracing of anti-racist ideas, that nobody should have to be defined by one aspect of who they are, that we should get to have our own ability to self-define and self-actualize and discover who we are. And since this is a church, I'll just go a step further, who we were created to be, and to fully live into that, without the culture and society and patriarchy and dominant culture and all those things telling us who and what we should be. So, yeah, we brought it back around, to the anti-racist film club ideas.
Excellent. I think that's a much better place to leave off.
I think so too.
Thank you for listening to the Anti-Racist Film Club podcast. If you haven't seen Barbie, it is currently out in theaters right now, so don't forget your pink shirt and go see it on the big screen. To learn more about the Anti-Racist Film Club itself, visit fumcoli.org or follow the links in our description below. It's basically impossible to spell Fumcoli, so you should probably just follow the links. This is a monthly podcast, so be sure to follow us on whatever platform you're currently listening to, such as Spotify, Anchor, or Apple Music, so you don't miss our next upload, which will probably be next month with the official Season 2 launch of our curriculum, which I'm very excited about. But before we sign off, I just want to thank you, Pastor Heather, for leading our conversation today.
And I want to thank you, Lauren, for inviting me to this conversation and having so much great stuff for us to talk about. And I just have one question to end with.
Mm-hmm.
Did you wear pink when you went to see Barbie movie, Lauren?
I wore pink socks.
Excellent. That totally counts.
I just got back from volunteering at church camp, and so I didn't have all of my clothes, and it was the only pink thing in my wardrobe, and I went with my mom and sister, who were decked out in like all the pink clothing from head to toe. So I was a little bit out of place in a theater where most people were wearing pink. And then, of course, last weekend I went to see Oppenheimer in a fully gray suit. So
Excellent. I love the theme clothing to go see these movies. Well, I wore pink and I had a Barbie mani, which was just about one of my favorite things to do, was to get my nails ready to go see a movie.
Excellent.
Well, thank you, Lauren.
And for everyone who tuned into our discussion, thanks for listening.